in a decade far, far away, I was a high school student, and somehow my preacher at the time got me to go to this thing called a Young Preachers Seminar. And it was taught by a teacher named Chuck Sackett. And I went, and then I had to preach Sunday night at my home church that weekend, probably because the preacher didn't want to preach Sunday night. He was trying to get the young preachers to do it, you know. And I did it, and something changed. And a few years later, I went back to that college at Lincoln Christian College and took more classes on preaching from Dr. Chuck Sackett. And here I am decades later. And everything I know about preaching, I learned from this man, or from those he pointed me to. And I know some of you are saying, goodness, Brooks, weren't you just off for a month on sabbatical? And you're right, but here's the truth. Any time that our church family gets the opportunity to hear from this man, I think is well worth our time. So, would you welcome today Dr. Chuck Sackett?
It was about 7 years ago next month when they discovered the remains of a body back behind the Slumberland store not far from our church building in Quincy, Illinois. After a very lengthy investigation, they finally identified the remains as a man by the name of Charles Hutton from LaBelle, Missouri. And the newspaper article that came out ran this line, which struck everybody that I talked to. No one reported him missing. And I'll bet some of you have that, right? You feel it? You just have this kind of sense that if suddenly you weren't there, nobody would bother to say, hey, where did they go? One of my favorite preachers, Fred Craddock, tells the story of a trip he took in Germany when he was studying there. He sat down on the train across the table from an elderly German woman. He spoke just enough German that they could carry on a bit of a conversation, and he discovered that she was from Rostock, which is on the other side. This is going to age some of you, in East Germany, the communist side, before the wall came down. And I began to carry on a conversation about what it was like to live there. And she told him this story, that as she was leaving East Germany after spending months getting papers to be allowed out of the area, she said to the guard, so what happens if I don't come back? And he sneered at her and said, who would care? No one would miss an old woman like you. You felt that way? Like you just not missed? You wake up one day and you just feel totally abandoned. Like nobody's paying any attention, nobody's listening, that you don't matter. And I suppose the only thing worse than actually having that happen, like it did to this older German lady, is when you wake up one morning or you go to bed one night and here's your question, does God even know I'm here? Did God go to sleep? Did somehow He forget me? Because if you haven't had that moment, I have. When you just wonder. December 1985, I had buried my parents. In October, I'd put my father-in-law in the hospital. In November and in December, I stood on the sidewalk with my wife and my 3 girls, and I watched my house go up in smoke, and I found myself asking, God, are you asleep? Are you not looking? Where are you? Don't I matter? I think that's what Isaiah's feeling. He at least is saying that's what Israel is feeling. He cites them on a couple of occasions in this lengthy passage that Brooks is taking you through from Isaiah 40 on. In fact, over in chapter 49, he has Zion, the people of God, saying, the Lord has forsaken me, my Lord has forgotten me. In our text this morning on Isaiah chapter 40, we're going to pick that text up where it was left off last week. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 27, he has Israel saying, "My way is hidden from the Lord, my right is disregarded by my God." The voice rendition of that particular text says this: "My troubled path is hidden from the eternal. God has lost all interest in my cause." In 1952, J.B. Phillips wrote a book, the title of which I am enamored by. It struck me the first time I read it. Your God is too small. Now, I will not project that on you. I'm just going to stand here and admit for you that there are days in my life when that title is an apt description of me. That my God is not big enough. He's too small. The text you went through last week called you to called you to cry out to a God who invites you to cry out, who invites you to depend on Him, who invites you to trust Him when circumstances don't seem to make any sense. Come to me, He wants you to do. From verse 12 on, the rest of the chapter is why. In fact, in many, many Bibles, what you'll discover is labeled right over verse 12, the incomparable God, God who cannot be compared. Why in the world would a people who feel abandoned, who wonder if God has somehow gone to sleep on them, turn around and in confidence call on Him? And yet that's the very thing that Isaiah is asking. Isaiah is asking the people of God to feel confident, resolute, content, because not what they do, but who God is. This is an invitation not for you to do something, just to recognize who God is. To just begin opening up the possibilities that you might recognize that God is greater than anything this world might come to give you. Now listen to the text. Come here to verse number 12. This opening paragraph. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? Who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man shows him counsel? Whom did he consult? Who made him understand? Who taught him the path of justice and taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding? Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket. They're accounted as the dust on the scales. Behold, he takes up the coastlands like fine dust. Lebanon wouldn't suffice for fuel, nor its beasts enough for burnt offerings. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness. You hear this proclamation, this announcement about who God is. Just think about it for a minute. He holds the waters of the earth in the cup of his hand. A cup, frankly. If I do it just right and I can keep my hands together and not leak too quickly, I can actually get a cup of water in here. He holds all the water on the face of the earth in the palms of his hands. In fact, here's the number. I don't even know what it means, but I will share it with you just the same because it's a pretty spectacular number. There are, according to those who measure such things, 352.7 sextillion gallons of water. He holds them in the palm of his hand. If your God can't do that, your God's too small. 93 million miles from here to the sun. That's our nearest star. We have absolutely zero way of trying to figure out how far it is out there to the other side of all of those galaxies. And yet, did you hear the text? Look back at the text. He measures the heavens by the span of his hand. 9 inches, by the way, if I stretch really hard. If I could play the piano, which I cannot, I couldn't even do an octave. He measures the skies, the heavens, with his hand. And Isaiah says, if your God can't do that, your God is too small. You heard him. Who taught him? With whom did he consult? To whom did God go for advice? Our national and state leaders surround themselves with advisors and consultants, and we all wish they might listen to them. Who teaches God? If your God needs an instructor, if your God needs someone to go and ask for advice, then your God is too small. That's what Isaiah says. Your God is too small. You saw it right here in the text. The nations are like a drop from a bucket. 196 or so nations. World powers of some kind. Back in his day, he would have been thinking Assyria, Babylon. A few years later, when this text would have been read by more recent people, they would have been thinking of Alexander the Great and the Hellenists, and we would have thought of Rome and the great armies. In fact, if we come to the 21st century, we might find ourselves thinking about people who had initials like USA and USSR and great powers. You know, we're actually a pretty old nation at 275 years or so. He says, this is what I do to the nations. We have this great butcher shop in Quincy. I go there every once in a while when I'm looking for really good meat, when company's coming. Don't do that for family, but when others are coming. And they always lay a piece of wax paper on the scale. And I always ask at the price of beef, how much does that weigh? God says, pile up all the nations, pile up all the weight of the earth, put it on a scale. It's nothing more than dust. My dad used to tell me there was a sky hook. That's how we knew how heavy things were. I believed him because I believed my dad knew everything. I'd never seen a sky hook holding up the earth, but there had to be one somewhere, right? Now, again, I don't know who comes up with these kinds of numbers. I don't know where they figure these things out, but this is what they tell me. The earth weighs 13.2 septillion pounds. That's 24 zeros. Did you hear what he said? It's like dust. If your God can't this to something so marginal as an earth, your God is too small, just too small. I think one of the reasons that I like Isaiah so well is that he has this sarcastic, cynical bent to him. And it really shows up in the next paragraph, and it shows up later in the sections that you're going to be going through. But look for now, look at verse 18. To whom then will you liken God? What likeness will you compare with him? An idol? A craftsman casts it, a goldsmith overlays it with gold and casts it with silver chains. He who is too poor for an offering chooses wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skilled craftsman to set up an idol who will not move. And you can just hear the sarcastic drip of Isaiah saying, particularly in a world that was filled with gods of all kinds, the kinds of gods that need a carpenter to set them up in a corner so they don't fall over, isn't much of a god. I have a birdhouse out in the back in my yard. It's on a pillar, and about every other day I have to go back out and stand it up. You know, and then I go out and I try to put some rocks under it and stand it up. The problem is it's rotten at the base. What I need to do is go out and cut it off and make it firm again. Do you hear how foolish this is? Do you not hear the sarcasm, the dripping cynicism? If your God needs someone to prop it up in a corner, your God is too small. He's going to say later, people go out in the woods, they cut down a tree. With half of the tree, they build a fire and they fix their supper. With the other half of the tree, they worship. If you can build a fire and cook your food with the same material out of which your God is made, then your God is too small. He's not done. He says here in verse 21, do you not know? Did you not hear? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth. Its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a curtain. He spreads them out like a tent to dwell in, who brings princes to nothing and makes rulers of the earth as emptiness. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth. He blows on them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. More creation language in the book of Isaiah than any place else in all of the Old Testament. More than Genesis, more than the Psalms. God makes, God spreads, God creates, but it isn't just that he does that. It's the God who creates, the God who spreads, the God who... It's his nature. It's not just something he can do. It is something that he is, and he says he's made this whole thing. And then he reminds us that all of these nations amount to naught. Listen, if you need a nation with initials like USA, USSR, if you need a nation that has nuclear power, if you need a nation that is a world-class leader, if you need a nation with a vast army to take control and to do what's necessary, your God is too small. Your allegiance is in the wrong place. The invitation is dependence upon God. An incomparable God. He says, verse 25, to whom will you compare me? That I should be like him, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes. Look, who created these? He brings out their host by number, calling them by name. By the greatness of his might and because he is strong in power, not one of them is missing. He's talking about the heavens. He's talking about the stars. He knows them all. He's named every one of them. He never misses a name. You know this feeling if you're a parent. You're trying to call one of your children and to get the dog's name in there before you get the right child. You're walking down the street, you see somebody that you know like the back of your hand, and you can't come up with a name to save your life? You felt it, haven't you? You felt it when you thought God forgot your name? That he didn't know where you were? Didn't know what happened to you? I used to love going up in the mountains when I was a kid out west and laying on the ground and just watching the falling stars. God knew every one of those stars, and he knew its name. He never missed a one. He never forgot a name. If your God forgets your name, your God's too small. So we come back to verse 27. This is Isaiah's concern, that Israel is complaining, that Israel is whining, wanting to know, God, have you forgotten us? God, have you somehow failed to pay attention to us? The Message translation puts it this way: why would you ever complain, O Jacob, or whine, Israel, saying, God has lost track of me. He doesn't care about what's happening to me. Don't you know anything? Haven't you been listening? God doesn't come and go. God lasts. He's creator of all that you can see or imagine. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't pause to catch his breath. He knows everything inside and out. Here's Isaiah's call. Trust in a God who can be depended upon. Just recognize nothing overwhelms God. Nothing is bigger than he is. Nothing is more powerful than him. Nothing stands in his way. Nothing can stop him from being God. And nothing that happens to you is ever overlooked, ever missed. Ever. And Isaiah says, I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just asking you to hang your hat on that. To just trust in a God who cannot be conquered. Listen, the last part of this text I'm sure you're familiar with. Verse 28, have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary. Young men shall fall exhausted, but they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run. They don't grow weary. They mount up. They fly. Why? God. This incomparable God who invites us to just trust him. Later on, Isaiah is going to say in chapter 49, is it possible for a mother, however disappointed, however hurt, to forget her nursing child? Can she feel nothing for the baby she carried and birthed? Even if she could, I, God, will never forget you. Look here, I have made you a part of me, written you on the palms of my hands. Your city walls are always on my mind, always my concern. Always. No matter what your circumstances are, no matter what's been going on in your life, no matter what comes tomorrow, you are always written on the palm of his hand. He knows your name. He never forgets you. If it were me, and I had my Bible in front of me, I would be writing a text right next to the end of Isaiah chapter 40. I'd be writing down Romans chapter 8. You know the one. Nothing can separate me from the love of God which is found in Christ Jesus, neither death nor life, principalities, powers, things present, things past, nothing separates us from the love of God. Nothing. Because he loves us in Jesus. This God who is incomparable, who cannot be compared, who is greater than anything the world has ever thrown at you. This God loves you so much that he chose to become a living human being and experience what you experience. And I need you to understand, when he was human, he was human. And his dependence on the Father is the same dependence that he's asking from you. Trust that God is big enough to handle it. When I first started going to church, you can guess one of the things that I was told right off the bat, and that is the importance of the resurrection of Jesus. That everything kind of hinged on Jesus' resurrection. Okay. And then two things happened. And all of a sudden, it made so much more sense. One was the movie Flatliners. Some of you older people may remember it. It's a bunch of doctors, interns, they're in a hospital setting, and they're in the evenings they go down in the basement and they put each other to death and then they revive each other. The contest is to see who can stay dead the longest. And my response to that is, that's really stupid. I mean, that's dumb. You better hope that those friends are really your friends. And then I read Philippians chapter 2 in that context and thought, you know what? When Jesus was dead, he was really dead. And if it were not for the voice of the Father calling him back to life, he'd still be dead. The cross and the tomb are the evidence of Jesus' great confidence in the love of the Father. Do you know that confidence? Do you know that deep, contented confidence that God's got this? Even on your worst day, He's got this. That in Jesus, He loves you more than anything. That He wrote you on the palm of His hand to never forget your name. You're invited to that Jesus, because if you don't know Him, life is tough. I don't know how you deal with it without Him. It's hard with Him. It's impossible without Him. God, it's hard to put into words our absolute confidence in You. Here we are reading Isaiah's attempt to put into words how big You are, how powerful, almighty You are, and we struggle to even wrap our minds around what it means for You to be God. God, we're sorry when our vision of You, when our perspective of You is too small. Thank You for forgiving us of that. God, keep enlarging our hearts toward You. Keep building our confidence in You. Help us trust in our darkest moments, in the times when we feel so abandoned. Help us believe that You are there, that You have this no matter what, because You had Jesus no matter what. It's in His name. Amen.